My fiance said real men don't cry and called me a big baby. Now I'm the one making him cry as I walk away. It all started about 6 months ago when Dan, my fiance of 4 years, casually dropped the idea of an open relationship on me. We were sitting on the couch after dinner, the TV buzzing in the background, when he just blurted it out. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My first instinct was to laugh, thinking it was a joke. But when I saw the serious look on his face, I realized he wasn't kidding. The idea seemed so out of left field, especially since we'd been in what I thought was a solid, committed relationship for years. But as I sat there trying to process what he was saying, I started to think about it differently. Maybe this was his way of spicing things up, of reigniting the passion that had faded over time. We'd become so comfortable with each other, almost like an old married couple, and I thought that maybe this could be a way to bring some excitement back. So, after mulling it over, I agreed. At the time, I convinced myself it was just an experiment, a temporary thing that wouldn't really change the dynamic between us. For the first few months, everything seemed fine. Dan started seeing a woman from his office, a coworker he'd mentioned in passing before, but never in a way that made me think anything was going on. I, on the other hand, started dating Jake, a guy I'd met at the gym. Jake was everything Dan wasn't: spontaneous, affectionate, and incredibly attentive. He'd take me on actual dates, showing up at my door with flowers, whisking me away for dinner or a movie, or even just a walk in the park. He made me feel special in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Dan, however, seemed to be retreating further into his own world. His idea of spending time together had become sitting in front of the TV, playing video games, or binge-watching some series. The romance was practically non-existent. Flowers? Only if I dropped enough hints around my birthday. Affection? A rare occurrence, something I had to practically beg for. It was like he had checked out of our relationship the moment we agreed to open things up. I started to feel more like a roommate than a fiancé. 3 months into this new arrangement, Dan came to me with another suggestion: polyamory. If I'm honest, I wasn't exactly sure what he meant at first. I thought we were already polyamorous, but as he explained, I realized he wanted something more serious, more committed, with multiple partners. He wanted to deepen his connection with his coworker, and was proposing that I do the same with Jake. It felt like we were slowly drifting further and further apart. But once again, I agreed. It seemed like the logical next step, given the path we were already on. As my relationship with Jake deepened, I couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between him and Dan. With Dan, intimacy had become something of a chore. It was quick, impersonal, and then he'd be off to do his own thing, usually involving a screen of some sort. But with Jake, everything was different. He took his time, always checking in to make sure I was comfortable, that I was enjoying myself. Afterward, he'd cuddle with me, stroke my hair, and even bring me snacks. Something as simple as a granola bar or a glass of water after being intimate. It was such a small gesture, but it made me feel more cared for than I had in years. Then came the conversation with my mom, the one that really set everything in motion. I was venting to her about how things had changed, how I felt like Dan and I were growing apart, and she asked me a simple question: who makes you happier? It was like a switch flipped in my brain. I realized I'd been avoiding the truth because I didn't want to confront what it meant for my future with Dan. The answer was so obvious, yet I hadn't allowed myself to fully admit it until that moment. Jake made me happier. He treated me like I was important, like I mattered. And Dan? He was becoming more of a background character in my life, someone I was starting to feel like I barely knew. That's when I knew I had to end things with Dan. The thought of marrying someone who couldn't or wouldn't show me the affection I craved, someone who saw my emotional needs as trivial, was terrifying. I deserved more, and I was finally ready to accept that. But breaking up with someone you've been with for 4 years isn't easy. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's heartbreaking. I decided to tell Dan over dinner, thinking a public place might keep things civil, might make the conversation a little less intense. But when I arrived at the restaurant, my stomach dropped. Dan hadn't just invited me, he'd also invited his parents. His mom was practically vibrating with excitement, pulling out pictures of flower arrangements, wedding dresses, and venues. She'd already picked out a date for dress shopping the next day. I felt like I was suffocating. Everything was happening so fast, and it was all so far removed from the reality of our relationship. As his mom rambled on about wedding plans, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I blurted out that the wedding was off. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Dan's face went pale. His mom's eyes filled with tears, and his dad just stared at me like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The silence was deafening. I tried to explain, tried to tell them that I didn't feel loved, that I needed more from Dan, but the words felt hollow. How do you explain to someone that the person they're planning to marry isn't who they thought he was? Dan's reaction was explosive. He started yelling, accusing me of blindsiding him, of making a scene in front of his parents. I tried to keep calm, but he was beyond reasoning. The restaurant staff eventually asked us to leave, and Dan stormed off, leaving me alone with his parents. I felt a mix of guilt and relief, knowing I had done the right thing, but also knowing I had hurt people in the process. I drove his parents home in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. They tried calling Dan several times, but he wasn't answering. I knew what was waiting for me when I got back to the apartment, a confrontation that I had been dreading, but one that needed to happen. When I walked through the door, Dan was waiting for me. The fight that followed was intense, filled with anger, hurt, and accusations. That's when he finally admitted the truth. The real reason he had wanted to open our relationship in the first place was so he could sleep with his coworker without feeling guilty. The polyamory suggestion? That was just his way of trying to legitimize the feelings he had developed for her. And then, in his anger, he called me a bitch, accused me of being a big baby who needed too much attention, and told me to grow up because real men don't get emotional. His words cut deep, but they also gave me the clarity I needed. This wasn't the man I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. He didn't respect me, didn't value me, and certainly didn't love me in the way I needed to be loved. A couple of days later, Dan called, begging me to come home so we could talk. He apologized, said he didn't mean what he had said, but the damage was done. When I told him he could talk to his girlfriend instead, he broke down and started crying. So much for real men don't get emotional. That was the final straw. I called Jake, and we had a long talk about where we were heading. To my surprise, he'd been thinking about closing our relationship for a while, but was afraid to bring it up, worried it might scare me off. I felt a sense of relief wash over me when he said he was happy I suggested it. It felt like everything was finally falling into place. Jake even helped me move all my stuff out of the apartment I had shared with Dan. That night, Dan called and texted me nonstop until I finally had to block him. His desperation was starting to scare me. Just when I thought things were settling down, something unexpected happened. Dan's girlfriend, the coworker he had wanted so badly, showed up at my work. She looked nervous, like she wasn't sure if she should be there. When I asked her what was wrong, she told me she was worried that I had ended things with Dan because of her. She seemed genuinely concerned, and I could see the guilt in her eyes. We sat down and talked, and I assured her it wasn't about her. It was about Dan and his inability to be emotionally available. I told her about our fight, about the things he had said, and as we talked, I could see her demeanor change. She started to question her relationship with Dan, realizing that she had been holding out hope that he would eventually open up, that he would become more comfortable with his emotions. But after hearing what I had been through, she wasn't so sure anymore. As she left, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. It was like a chapter of my life had ended, and a new one was beginning. I didn't know what the future held with Jake, but I was excited to find out. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was making decisions for myself, not for anyone else. I was done settling for less than I deserved. Isn't it funny how life works out? You think you know someone, you think you've got